Okay. As the biography says, Paul was born at an early age.
Okay, you are.
And again, Murphy O'Connor, maverick that he is, most scholars will place Paul's birth probably around sometime in the first decade AD. That would put him between 10 and 15 years younger than Jesus. Because Jesus was born in 6 BC, probably. The reason why they suggest Jesus being born in 6 BC is Herod the Great was alive, and he was, when he found out about the birth of this newborn king from the Magi, he was, sent his folks up there to slaughter all the kids under 2 years age. So ascertaining the time, Jesus may have been about, it was very shortly after that Herod died. And so it's pretty evident Jesus was born a couple of years before Herod died. And so whoever, well, it was a guy by the name of Little Dennis, Dionysius Exiguus, in about the 6th century, is the one who counted back from available records when the birth of Jesus would be, because it's actually at that time that they started measuring years, timeline, from supposedly the birth of Jesus. So it was only about the 6th century AD that they actually started distinguishing BC, before Christ, and AD, Anno Domini, or Year of the Lord, or as often they do now, BCE, before the Common Era, CE, after the Common Era. However you may or may not prefer that. But he made a mistake, an error in his calculations, and that ended up that year 0, the transition, would actually have been 6 years after Jesus was born. There's another interesting thing is nobody really knows if there is a year 0, or if it goes up to 1 BC and then 1 AD. So there's speculation on both sides. So at any rate, Jesus was born 6 years in 6 BC. And like I say, we know that from the evidence of the time of King Herod. Murphy O'Connor feels that they were roughly contemporaries, and that Paul was born, Saul, not born in Tarsus, where we will visit, right here, but born in a city in northern Galilee, about 30 miles north of Nazareth, called Gishala, or Giskala, and 20 miles from Nazareth. Okay. The reason for that is it was a prosperous small city that was destroyed in 4 BC for a revolt following the death of Herod the Great. And its population was sold into slavery. That means Paul's family were among those rounded up by the Roman army and sold into slavery. Why did the Roman army do that rather than just kill everybody? Well, anybody that you could keep alive and sell into slavery, hey, there's a profit. And the Romans, they felt that if they were going to keep peace in an area, that the local people should be the ones to pay for that peacekeeping effort. How will they pay for it? Well, let's round up enough of the citizens and take them off and sell them into slavery, and that money will then pay for the army that, quote, kept the peace. So that was a fairly common practice. The Tarsus, well, so Paul would probably be about 2 or 3 years old when his family was sold to, from down here in Galilee, was sold to probably a wealthy family in Tarsus. They must have been pretty good folks because they valued this slave family enough after a certain length of time, maybe when Paul was a preteen or even a teenager, to give them freedom. Now, the family must also have valued education, even for their slave kids, because it's pretty obvious that family took real responsibility for these people who were serving them, because Paul went to. Let's put it this way: there is certainly evidence that Paul had a good classical education. He knew Greek. He knew how to write Greek. He knew how to communicate in Greek. He knew rhetoric. He knew the classics. And there's in his letters, there is some reference here and there to the classics as well as the style of oratory. He was very, very literate. And most Jews of that time were not all that literate, especially not in Greek. They would probably know enough Greek to be able to get by in the Greek-speaking world. At home they would speak Aramaic. At the synagogue they would speak or understand Hebrew. You don't have to be literate to be multilingual. And you don't have to be literate to be intelligent. And most people had no particular reason to be illiterate. Even the letters that Paul wrote, they didn't run them off on a Xerox machine and give them out to everybody like these notes. People came and listened to them being read by possibly the one teacher in town who might actually be capable of reading them. Everybody else could understand them in Greek, but there would not be that many who could actually read them. So Paul had an early classical education. Sometime during that time, this family freed the family. Now, how do we know? Because it's not specifically in the Bible. How do we know that Paul's family was taken into slavery and received their freedom because he was a Roman citizen? That's the answer you're going to give, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
And he fought for the soldier. He was a soldier.
He what?
Wasn't he a soldier in the Roman?
No, he wasn't a soldier in the Roman army. But he was a Roman citizen, and he was really quite proud of being a Roman citizen. How would a humble, but perhaps obviously prosperous Jewish family become Roman citizens? The primary way was, at that time, freedmen and their families. If they were slaves of a Roman citizen, upon getting their freedom, they would become Roman citizens. So, and that was, there were different classes of Roman citizens, but pretty much the rights, like the rights for a trial before the emperor and all of that, they had that right. They had the rights of the Roman citizens. So, the way it got was through having been a slave. He was also then sent to Jerusalem to study with Gamaliel, who was a Pharisee. And so he would have been about a mid-teenager at that time. He had already had his classical education in Greek, in culture. Now he was going to get his religious education, and he got his religious education from the absolute best of the teachers, who was Gamaliel down in Jerusalem. He became a Pharisee. The Gospels notwithstanding, the Pharisees were pretty much good guys. And they were the ones who were the most concerned about the authenticity of how they would follow the law, how they would be God's people by taking the Torah, the law of God through Moses, taking that seriously. And what Jesus criticizes them is they took the written word maybe a little too seriously by building up all kinds of practical safeguards against violating any part of the Torah and therefore becoming unclean or displeasing in God's eyes. So, but they took, it's a little unfair the way that they're treated in the Gospels, but because they weren't just hypocrites, but they probably did go a little too far. And that's not to say there weren't hypocrites among them. You have a lot of ex-Catholics who will say, well, I left the church because they're all hypocrites. Well, maybe the rest of them are, but you and I know that we're not. So at any rate, Saul went down to study with the very best, Gamaliel, became a Pharisee, became zealous for the law. Saul was one of these people, a little bit like Aiden and myself, and maybe like Marianne. Once we get into something, we do not let go of it. We have to be kind of careful about what we get into, because it tends to captivate us. You heard that with what Aiden was talking about, the carpets. And, people say to me, why don't you take pilgrimages somewhere else? I'm sorry, but I can truly be in love with and married to one thing at a time. Thank you very much. If I were to start taking pilgrimages elsewhere, I would have to, I would just become obsessed with that place too. So, one obsession at a time is quite enough. I think Saul was obsessed with, basically obsessed with God as a Pharisee. And so that is one reason why there is good suspicion that he probably married, because it was unheard of that a Pharisee would not marry. That's what God commanded. They have had some children. It's therefore it's probably probable that his wife died. Maybe died under gut-wrenching emotional circumstances. Wasn't unusual to die in childbirth. Many women did. The infant mortality rate was well over 50% at that time, and the maternal mortality rate was pretty high. There was not. It was not unusual for one man to be the father of 10 children by 4 wives, sort of like Johann Sebastian Bach. And all of those wives died in childbirth. May have been a fire. Fires were very common too. And of course, to lose your family in a fire would be, in some ways, very devastating, maybe even more so than childbirth, because childbirth, that was sad, but that's sort of the way things were and God's will there. But, what Murphy O'Connor speculates is because there is no indication of his being married, having been married, every indication that he was not married at this time. He did not have an anti-marriage view. What he basically said in a couple of his letters is, the time is short, stay where you are. If you're unmarried, if you're a virgin, stay that way, because Jesus is coming, quick. If you're married, stay that way. And don't make any great lifestyle change, because the Lord is coming quickly. That he did say, at least in the early times. There's very little evidence that the Pharisees as such were engaged in persecuting Christians the way that Saul was. So Saul was going beyond what would have been the norm for a Pharisee of his time. But I think part of the reason is his obsession. He was able to see that if what these followers of the way, these disciples of Christ, if what they were believing and preaching about Christ was true, that demolished what he was holding on so dearly for as sacred, what he was so obsessed with. So he would be obsessed with putting them down in whatever way he could because of his religious convictions, which seemed to go beyond what the rest of the Pharisees were doing and believing. So,
that's okay. So there's my misunderstanding, because when you read about Saul, it's comma, zealously persecuted Christians.
Yeah.
And then so basically, but the Jewish did not persecute them. Would he then turn them over to the Romans to be persecuted? I mean, that's...
No.
That's where I find the... Where's the line there, Father? Help me out.
And it's not that the Jews weren't persecuting them. I mean, there was the death of Stephen.
Yes.
There were, but there were pockets, there were periods where, and the other evidences of the early persecution by Jews seem to be sort of like mob rule. Somebody stirs them up.
Okay.
It doesn't seem to be a systematic thing like was later in the Roman times.
Okay.
What else?
Yeah.
So he's on the road to Damascus. He has this vision, this revelation of the risen Christ. It's told 3 times, interestingly, 3 times in the Acts of the Apostles, and described just very simply in 1 Corinthians. Last of all, as one untimely born, he appeared also to me. More substantial, I did not receive the gospel from a human being, nor was I taught it, but it came through a revelation of Jesus Christ. And so witness to the resurrection became his central mission. Did that event on the road to Damascus happen exactly the way that it is described in the Acts of the Apostles? One of the things that we all know is that Luke was a very careful historian, but he was not meticulous about relating the chronicles, the facts, the newspaper journalism. What Luke did was also to give witness to the work of the Holy Spirit in the church. That means, as virtually any writer of that time would have done, you select and you massage your texts, your sources, in order to best display what you want them to say. So sometimes we need to accept what Luke says, but not take it necessarily as a chronicle or a journalistic account, but rather a lot of folks at that time, it's looked down upon now, but they will invent dialogues, they will invent sermons, speeches, they will invent sometimes events, as to, in order to reach the conclusion that we've got, this is what ought to have happened, even though they may not fully know. They will piece things together and sometimes, invent bridges and that kind of thing between them. That was a style. That was a style in those days of just much historical writing. Now, after that conversion, it is claimed that he went to Arabia, probably in present-day Jordan, and preached there. Didn't seem to be too successful. Came back to Damascus, had a sort of a 3-year apprenticeship where he would certainly have learned at that time all the stories about Jesus and learned what the apostles were saying and all of that. Then he goes down to Jerusalem and spends 2 weeks with Peter. Also, he always calls Peter Cephas, which is his Aramaic name. Lectors always mispronounce it as Cephas because it's spelled with a C, but it actually is pronounced, the Aramaic is Cephas, which means rock. So remember, Peter's original name was Simon. That would be his Jewish name. And it seems at this time he came to terms with the importance of the crucifixion. That the crucifixion was an integral part of God's plan, not just an embarrassment. Not just something he had to go through in order to get the resurrection, but that, as I always say a lot, and did at the beginning of this, beginning of today, the self-giving of Jesus in the crucifixion is that he identified with the lowest of what it means to be human. And so that became very much a part of Paul's faith and a part of Paul's teaching. He went for a time, possibly a number of years, back to his hometown of Tarsus. We don't know what he did there. We don't know how long. But around 45, he was brought back to Antioch at the instigation of Barnabas. Barnabas actually went back to Tarsus to recruit Paul. This is in the Acts of the Apostles. Now, the church in Antioch was a very strong center for mission. That is where many of the apostles and the disciples of the apostles went after some of the persecution began to get hot in Jerusalem. A good number of them stayed in Jerusalem, but many went to Antioch. In Antioch, it was a tremendously large, important Roman city, and it had a large mixed Christian community. By large, 50 to 100? Certainly under 1,000. Of both Jewish and Gentile Christians. And they more or less got along. But there were tensions. The Jews would not eat with the Gentiles. So they couldn't celebrate Eucharist together. Because Eucharist was always celebrated in a communal meal. Why? Well, those Gentile Christians, they just might be, they might be my brother in Christ, but I wouldn't put it past them to try to slip some pork into this meal. Or some meat sacrificed to the gods. The Gentiles didn't really have any scruples about eating meat from the marketplace, which was kind of the leftovers from some sacrifices. there were some big differences there. There were probably a few other tensions that I don't think I mentioned right here. One of them, of course, had to do with a certain Jewish Christian resentment that these folks did not have to obey the Torah, did not have to become Jewish in order to become Christian, in order to follow Christ. I try to avoid saying become Christian at this particular point. You'll see why in a minute. The other thing is that the Jewish Christians had paid a big price for their following of Christ because they were alienated from their fellow non-disciple Jews. They were thrown out of the synagogues because they had accepted Jesus Christ. They were disciples of Christ. So they were saying, we're paying this big price. These Gentiles just kind of come in, they got a free ride. You know, they don't have to worry about whether they are being ostracized by their fellow Jews. And at that point, there was not the ill will from the rest of the Roman community against these Christians. So now they were, in a sense, resented because they were getting a free ride. There's another source of resentment here. We tend to think of Paul going into a Jewish synagogue in his various cities, various travels, and preaching there to the Jews, getting kind of rejected, maybe making a few followers, but getting pretty much rejected, and then going down into the marketplace to the Gentiles, to the pagans. That's not quite the way it was. Every synagogue in the diaspora being those Jews living in these various Roman colonies, and there were a lot more out in the diaspora than there were down in Jerusalem or in Judea and Galilee. In fact, there were definitely more Jews in Alexandria at that time than there were in Jerusalem. Another footnote that I can't help but add. Remember the flight into Egypt when Herod was after Jesus to kill him? And we kind of picture, this little refugee family going into alien territory. Well, there were probably about a couple of 100,000 Jews living in Alexandria, some of whom may have been their relatives. So it wasn't like they were going into hostile territory. They were going into the Jewish community in Egypt. And that's not to say that the travel and the circumstances of it didn't have its own hardships. It certainly did. But, they were going, it was sort of like going to visit Uncle Simon and his family back in New York because they got to get out of L.A. So that's kind of an interesting little sideline there too. Jews were all over the place in the Roman Empire, and they were really well respected by the Romans, and well tolerated. We won't be able to get into that here, but on the bus we will be talking about the sources of persecution in the Roman Empire, and the relationship of the early Christians to the Jewish communities in those first generations. But here, what was happening, that's the end of the footnote. Here, what was happening in the synagogues was these Jewish communities, synagogues in the diaspora, they were, by their moral way of life, and even their monotheism, was very, very attractive to a lot of the surrounding Romans who were looking for there were a whole bunch of different religions. The Romans were very tolerant of religions, tolerant of new religions. All you had to do was worship the gods of Rome, and worship the emperor. And if you did that, you could worship whoever else you wanted to. The problem with Christians was not that they worshipped Christ or that they worshipped the God of the Father of the Jews. The problem with the Christians was they refused to worship the emperor and to worship the local city gods and refused to worship the overall gods of Rome. That was the problem. That's what earned them their persecution. But the Romans were very, very tolerant. It was, so the Jews were pretty much attractive to people who are looking for some kind of religious and moral grounding that they weren't seeing in the plethora of all of these other gods and philosophies. So there were a lot of pagans who were associated with the synagogues. They were sometimes called, I guess, righteous Gentiles, but the other term for them, I forget what the other term was, but they were appreciated by the Jews of the synagogue, largely because they paid attention to them, they listened to them, they loved their teaching, and they also financially supported them. And often the big money for building a synagogue would come from some of the Roman pagan people who were attracted there, rather than from the Jews, who often were a fairly poor community in some places. So there was a certain economic thing happening here. Now, the Jews really saw a good advantage here because maybe some of these would become Jews. Wonderful. Welcome. But they were paying attention to us even if they weren't becoming Jews. They were paying attention to us. They were helping us. They were supporting us. And now all of a sudden, here comes this preacher, Jewish, speaking about the Messiah, Jesus. The Jews can't quite buy this. But isn't this good news from for the Gentiles who were associated with it? Because all of a sudden, Paul is saying, you really don't have to be Jewish in order to inherit the promises that God made to the Jews. Because Jesus himself is the fulfillment of that. Well, you know what sheep stealing is. That's basically, I think, what many of the Jews were seeing Paul and some of the other followers of Christ doing. They were preaching a way of inheriting the promises that God made to Abraham and to those who kept the law, to those who were faithful as Jews. They could get that without having to become Jewish because Jesus is being preached as the fulfillment of that. And so, you don't have to be Jewish. Just follow Jesus. Follow the way of Jesus. So, now that too would make the Jews, the faithful Jews in the synagogues, absolutely furious. And that's one reason why Paul found himself often hounded by the Jews from place to place, because he was preaching a message that was very attractive to the Gentile followers of who were interested in the Jewish way of life and the law of Moses. Does that make sense? So that's, to me, an interesting thing that we're going to be seeing when we get to Antioch is there is a cave up on the hill, up on the side of the mountain, called the Grotto of St. Peter, with a Byzantine front on it that was supposed to be the early church where the apostles and the first Christians worshipped. They may have, but they were not there to escape from the Romans. The Romans weren't persecuting them yet. Nor were they there to escape from anybody, because, as you will see when we get there, that hillside is pocketed with caves, grottos, little sanctuaries. Each one of them was a shrine to a god. That hillside was kind of the religious center for that whole town, that whole area. And folks would be coming and going there. So the Christians build their own there, fine. Nobody would bother about that at that time. Where the Christians celebrated the Eucharist would have been in houses down in the old quarter, down close to the river Orontes. And the Catholic Church is there now in a house that has been converted to church use. It was donated to the church by a Turkish family and was converted to church use, and that means that we will be celebrating Mass, not up there at the place that all the tourists learn is the Christian shrine, but we'll be celebrating Mass actually in a house church, a modern version of what they were doing 2,000 years ago there, which to me is just absolutely neat. And down there, Father Federico will tell us all about the church life in Antioch. This first journey with Barnabas did not go terribly well. It wasn't very long. I think you've got it in one of your, it's the one on blue, with blue. Basically they came from here down to Cyprus and then up to what's today's Antalya. And one of the things that kind of tears my heart out is that we don't go here. There's lots of really good stuff here down in Antalya. And there's also Santa Claus Land down here in Myra. So that's worth going to, but if we went there, we would have to give up something else. Probably this is what we'd have to give up. And between this and this, Tarsus and Antakya, I don't want to give this up. Particularly because this is so much off the beaten tourist track. This is extremely much in the tourist track. So if you ever go to Turkey again, be sure you go to Antalya. Take in this whole southern coast. Magnificent. But as you can see, we're going to be bypassing that a fair amount. From Antalya, he did get up here to Pisidian Antioch and to Iconium. Iconium is where St. Thecla became enamored of him and abandoned her betrothed, much to her mother's displeasure, and became a disciple of Paul's. Paul seems to have been embarrassed by her. He never writes about her. He refused to baptize her, so she baptized herself. But she was, kind of, along with Mary Magdalene.
Like the groupie, huh?
Yeah, along with Mary Magdalene, Thecla was venerated in the early church as maybe a proto-feminist sort of saint, even though it's in 20th century terminology that we have to begin to recognize that. But what we have with Thecla, this isn't in your notes here. It is, Thecla is pictured in that famous fresco over here in Ephesus. But what we have with Thecla is, an embodiment, as I believe, with Mary Magdalene, an embodiment of what Paul articulated, may not have always practiced as well as we might like, but articulated that there is no male-female distinction among the followers of Christ. There may be diversities of societal roles that you don't necessarily want to do away with, but that all can equally be disciples of Christ, all can equally be his followers. And it's with Thecla that we have the beginnings of a movement of organized virginity within the church. And she brought into around herself followers who were dedicated to virginity. They gave up the life of marriage. But remember this, at its best, marriage was entering a relationship of a superior to an inferior. And the woman was not the superior. Okay? At its best, there was that built into the institution of marriage. So the only way to really be an autonomous person had to be apart from that relationship of marriage. Now, obviously, within the relationship of marriage, there were all kinds of wonderful opportunities and possibilities for autonomy, but you were still, the wife always had a relationship of dependence upon the male. The woman in antiquity went from dependence on her father's house to dependence on her husband's house. And many realized that the only way to break that would be to remain unattached. And then they developed the model of, well, I am attached to Jesus. And so that's what's behind the origin of it. It's not just a question of sexual abstinence being better than a life within a sexual relationship. It's that is certainly seen as part of it, but that is secondary. The primary thing with virginity was a woman, that was the only road by which a woman could achieve autonomy from dependence upon a male patriarchal structure. And Thecla was one of the pioneers of that for the Christian sensitivity. One little additional thing before we leave Antioch. It says in the Acts of the Apostles, this is where the followers of the way were first called Christians. Now, the word Christiani or Christianoi, to take the word Christ, meaning the Anointed One, and add that suffix to it, to make it Christiani, people who are following Christ, is the label always given to a faction in a dispute. So in other words, they were called Christiani in order to distinguish them from others. Probably the Judeani or Judaioi, the Jews. There was a beginning of more and more of a distinction here, that Christians were more and more being seen not as being closely related to Jews, as sort of being a sect of Judaism or a certain group following a certain way, but achieved a distinct identity. So it's in Antioch that distinct identity, probably as a result of conflict, because most distinct identities are defined because somebody else is opposing that, right? So probably as a result of some kind of conflict, they began to be known by that distinctive name of Christians. Where are we, time-wise? 3:02.
I'm just leaving.
I'm ready for a little break. Are you?
Yes.
Let's take a maybe 6-minute stretch break.